here. And well, right now we're going to do some stretching. I want to ask you to please, if you can, leave your things on the floor and stand up. And please just stretch your arms as far as you can to the ceiling. Maybe move from one side to the other. And give a very big sigh, like, and you can see it right now. So we are going to receive our teacher, Dr. Tal Ben-Shahar, for his lecture today, for his session. So give it to Tal.
Hello, everyone, wherever you are and whenever you are. It's so amazing to be here with you in person, in 3 dimensions or multiple dimensions, and to spend time with you. Thank you for making it here. Hello to everyone who's watching us now. Can't wait to see you in person in future retreats. We're in a very special place. Akumal, Mexico, is where the whole field of positive psychology was born. This is where it started, where this remarkable shift in focus in the field of psychology started, with some of the leading researchers in the world coming here under the leadership of Professor Martin Seligman to talk about the future of psychology, to talk about where we're going as a society and what psychology can do to help. And what I want to do today is connect what we're doing to everything that was done before us. Because, as the saying goes, if we can see further, it is because we are standing on the shoulders of others. And it's always like that. There is always a chain that we're part of. And the question is, what do we do as part of that chain? Do we continue the trajectory? Do we improve it? Do we grow it? Do we take a shift? And just as Yuval's story indicated, we're all part of a chain. We have our grandparents who have theirs. We have the people we touch. We have our friends. We have our students. We have strangers that we meet, whose lives we can change just by a smile or a word, or an idea, or a hug. Because as we know, everything is interconnected. And if we flap our wings, we're moving particles that move other particles, and we're changing the world. And the question is, as part of this system, because a chain is a system, it's whole, what role do we play? So I want to situate us in that chain as a group, as students, and we're all students of happiness studies. Where are we? What came before us? And now we can go all the way back to the first person, or maybe the first cell, or maybe Adam and Eve. We can go all the way back to, and try to explain where we're situated. But I'm not going to go that far back. We don't have that much time. I'm only going to go back to the beginning of the humanistic psychology movement. Humanistic psychology was launched in the mid-1950s. It was the brainchild, or even more so the heart child, of great psychologists, some of whom I'll talk about in a minute, like Carl Rogers, whom I often talk about, quote, who said, "What is most personal is most general," considered one of the fathers of modern therapy. So Carl Rogers, and it was Rollo May, and Abraham Maslow, and Karen Horney, and a few others who got together as a group because they said, psychology needs to change. We need to create what they coined the third force of psychology. The third force of psychology comes in reaction to the first two forces of psychology, again linked by a chain to those first two forces, building on them, but trying to change the trajectory, the direction of that chain. What are the first two forces? The first one is behaviorism. Behaviorism, its most famous scholar was B.F. Skinner. And what behaviorists say is that we're essentially like billiard balls. Something hits us, and we move as a reaction to that thing. And then we hit something else, and that moves in reaction to another. And if you want to change the direction of those billiard balls, the direction, the trajectory of our lives, what you need to do is just reinforce new behavior. In his most famous book, B.F. Skinner, Walden 2, he basically created a utopian, or what he perceived to be a utopian society, where we reinforce the things that we want to see, such as kindness, generosity, love, openness. We reinforce those behaviors, and we take away any reinforcement for negative behaviors, such as hostility, harm, and so on. And through reinforcement, we're able to essentially control human behavior and therefore human destiny. Very good intentions. However, they ignored that we're not just a reaction to external reinforcements. They ignored the fact that we have a mind, that we have a heart, that this is not just an empty thing that responds, reacts to external circumstances. This thing can also choose. It can choose well or poorly. It can choose to harm or to help. But behaviorism just looked at the external. That what's in here doesn't matter. So that's one. That's the first force, behaviorism, that gained a lot of adherence, a great deal of popularity among psychologists. And then there is the second force, which is psychoanalysis, that said, again, as part of the same chain that builds, that grows, no, it's not about the external as much as it is about the internal. What's going on in here? And if you want to create the ideal human, the ideal life, what you need to do is focus on thoughts and emotions, exactly the things that behaviorism chose to ignore. The thing there with psychoanalysis and its parents, chief among them being Freud, of course, is that they said that what drives us within are neuroses. What drives us within are the dark forces. And we need to learn to curb them, to repress them. So the worldview that both these first forces brought to us was quite a dark one. Because the behaviorists say, there is no agency, there is no self, actually. It's, you're like a billiard ball or like a machine. And you'll be controlled by whatever is done unto you. And then psychoanalysis said, no, that's not true. We do have volition. We can choose. The inside matters a lot, but the inside is actually pretty grim and dark. And we need to somehow learn to control that darkness that lies within. So a very grim, dark worldview comes from both these forces. And then came the third force. And then came humanistic psychology. And I wasn't alive then, but my teachers were, and they told me that it was like a breath of fresh air coming into the academic world. That suddenly Abraham Maslow, was delivering lectures about human potential, about human greatness, about self-actualization, about dreams, about the light rather than the dark. And Carl Rogers talked about the human potential and how much there is of it in each and every one of us, and all we need to do is create the right conditions for this self, for this greatness that lies within to emerge. We're all seeds with incredible potential, and we need to water it and shed light on it. And then we will flourish. And it was a breath of fresh air. And suddenly the dark rooms of academia were lit up by these great thinkers, by these great minds, by these great hearts. But there was a problem. While initially the humanistic psychology movement started with these great ideas, certainly great intentions, very quickly it opened up to just about anyone who wanted to come in. Not just in terms of studying it, but in terms of contributing to it. And what happened, and where its ultimate failure lay at that time, was that the founders didn't introduce a rigorous methodology. They didn't insist on science. Just about anything could become part of humanistic psychology. And if you read the journals, humanistic psychology journals, initially, Rollo May wrote there, Abraham Maslow, Carl Rogers. But then very quickly, it evolved into what today we know as the self-help movement or the New Age movement, with no barriers to entry. And again, I'm not talking about barriers to entry in terms of who can study it, but there were no barriers to entry, which of course there shouldn't be any, but there were no barriers to entry in terms of what constitutes a good idea, a powerful theory, a good practice. And people came up with ideas which seemed great, and they came in through the front door. And it lost its rigorous scientific foundation. Every idea deserves to be tested, of course, but not every idea works. Not in our personal lives, we make mistakes, and certainly not when it comes to interventions. Psychologists, or coaches, or sociologists, or parents, we all make mistakes. And what science comes to do is to test and to see, and if you make a mistake, what can you learn from it? And it's important to make mistakes. It's important to test theories and ideas. The scientific method is important. And humanistic psychology then did not insist on it. And it evolved. And it essentially became what we know today as the self-help or New Age movement. And it lost its credibility within the ivory tower in academia. It lost its credibility in the eyes of many psychologists. Today, there are humanistic psychologists who are doing fantastic, important work, which is rigorous, which is driving the field forward. However, at that time, late 60s, especially early 70s, after Maslow passed away, after Rogers was no longer around, at that time, it went away in a direction that did not help its cause. And then came positive psychology. Positive psychology came to learn from humanistic psychology. And it learned a great deal. Again, we're all part of a chain. It stood on its shoulders, so to speak. And created what today is a thriving and flourishing movement. And I want to talk a little bit about those people responsible for the birth of positive psychology that brought us here to Acumel in 1999, 23 years ago. And how that is connected to Acumel 2022, where we're also part of that chain. So let me begin with whom I perceive to be, and this is just a sample, but whom I perceive to be the grandparents of positive psychology. So the first grandparent of positive psychology, to my mind, has to be Maslow. Maslow in 1954. Remember, positive psychology was born in 1998. January 1999 is when Acumel took place. In 1954, Abraham Maslow wrote a chapter in a book which he titled Towards a Positive Psychology. 1954, Towards a Positive Psychology, where he wrote that psychology focuses too much on the dark side, on the things that are not working, and we need to focus on optimism. We need to focus on joy, on love, on self-actualization, on realizing our potential. He then became president of the American Psychological Association and moved his agenda forward. And what he also said, and this is very relevant to what we're doing today, and certainly to the whole positive psychology movement, what he said is that we need a Manhattan Project-like approach to human psychology. What is the Manhattan Project? Manhattan Project is actually a war project. Seems like what's the relevance to positive psychology? You'll see in a minute. In World War II, Albert Einstein himself went to the President of the United States, Roosevelt, and he said to him, he said, the Nazis are working on a weapon that can destroy the world, certainly win the war. And he explained to him, in layperson's terms, what today we know as atomic weapons. And he said, this is just a theory, but they understand it, we understand it, it can be done. And we need to do it first before the Nazis do it. And the way to do it is to bring the biggest names, the greatest names in physics to work on it together. And they did. And they brought them together under the leadership of an MIT professor by the name of Oppenheimer. And they brought them together, people, the greatest physicists, like Niels Bohr, Fermi, Oppenheimer. And they got together to design what today we know as the atomic weapon, and they called it the Manhattan Project. And they said, we need to bring together the greatest minds in order to save the free world. So, putting aside the value of atomic weapons, as history tells us, they did it first, the free world was saved. I'm not talking about whether it was a good thing to do or a bad thing to do. Obviously, the world would be a better place if we didn't have atomic weapons, though it would be a much worse place if the Nazis had created atomic weapons first. But putting aside the ethical issue here, the Manhattan Project symbolizes and signifies the coming together of the greatest minds in the service of a better world. And this is what Maslow said we need to focus on. Bring together the best minds and hearts in the service of creating a better world. And this was his vision of a humanistic psychology. And that vision we see very much in the writings of, in the words of Professor Martin Seligman 30 years later. Not to mention, Towards a Positive Psychology in 1954, brought to the future 1998 and 1999, right here. So that's Abraham Maslow. Then there is Karen Horney. Karen Horney was a student of Freud, a product of the second force of psychology, a brilliant scholar, thinker, and therapist. And she worked with Freud for years. And then she said to him, listen, Sigmund, we're focusing too much on the dark side. Why are we ignoring that people also have great potential? Great potential for greatness, that they are seeds to be watered. Why are we ignoring that? And he dismissed her observation. And she said, fine, I'm very grateful to you. I will continue this chain. But I'm going to shift it a little bit. I think we need to focus also on what works. And she was the first leading psychologist to explicitly talk about our need to focus on the light, not just the dark. And she said something else, which is very important. She said we should not ignore the dark, just as we shouldn't ignore the light. We need to look at both. So when I talk about reality, that's Karen Horney reminding us that all exists within us. And she shifted the focus of millions of people because she taught many therapists, who then taught others, who then saw many, to focus on neurosis and psychosis and problems and evil, which is what psychology focused on, and, not or, and to focus on joy and love and virtue and generosity and kindness, which are also part of the human condition. What great contribution by this great woman. And then she also talked about another idea. In her book, Self-Analysis, which gave rise to all the research that we know today on journaling. In her book, Self-Analysis, she talks about neuroses. And she said, you know the thing about neuroses is that they never go away. They're always there. They're always part of us. And why is this so important? Because essentially what she's saying is that, let's say we have perfectionistic tendencies, or we have a tendency to become angry at the slightest provocation. These are neuroses. And she says these neuroses never go away. They're always there. She didn't talk in this language because they didn't have the science then, but there are neural pathways around our reaction, which could be an angry reaction, or a perfectionistic reaction, or a low self-esteem or low self-confidence reaction. These neuroses, they're always there, she says, and therefore we need to always manage them. And this affected the addiction movement. Her idea affected the addiction movement because look at the AA. When people introduce themselves, even let's say I've been clean for 25 years. I say I've not drunk for 25 years, and when I introduce myself, it's my name is Tal and I'm an alcoholic. It's not my name is Tal and 25 years ago I was an alcoholic. Now people look at that and say, why do you say that? You're not. Because they understand that the neural pathways are still there, even after 25 years. That's Karen Horney's idea. And what she's saying here is that we need to be vigilant. We need to pay attention. We need to remember that these tendencies are always there, and therefore we need to continuously manage them. And this is a very important point that doesn't just apply to the addiction movement, it applies to any change process. Why? Because so many people make the mistake, and this is a real barrier to lasting change, that once they feel like they've overcome a certain obstacle, let's say once I feel, well, I'm no longer anxious, or I no longer lose my temper when I shouldn't, then I've arrived. Then I no longer need to be concerned about it. I can move on. And what Karen Horney is saying, not so quickly. Those neural pathways are still there. You need to continue to manage them. You need to continue to do whatever it is that you're doing. And therefore, let's say my intervention that I introduce is meditation. I don't meditate until the point when I'm feeling calm. I meditate my whole life. Or exercise. Yeah, I feel a lot better as a result of exercise. That's not the time to stop. It simply says, you're on the right track. Continue doing what you're doing. Or maybe experiment with slightly different things. But it's not to throwing it away. Or when I fall in love. This is not saying, okay, you have arrived. Now you'll live happily ever after. No, this is the time to start working, to invest. And this is what Karen Horney is telling us in her research. Now, what is she telling us? Maybe something that we don't like to hear because, it would be great if you could go through a 3-day program working on anger management or dealing with anxiety or generating calm. And after those 3 days, check, you've graduated. You can live happily ever after. She's telling us no, that's not the case. And unfortunately, and I go back to the 1950s and 60s, unfortunately, a lot of the self-help or New Age movement has created interventions where the message is, implicitly or explicitly, the message is, read this book, take our training, do those 5 things, and then you're all set. Then you'll live happily ever after. And what she said in her important work is that it's a lifelong journey. We don't arrive. We improve, we grow, but we never arrive. We're always evolving. We can always become better. We can always learn. We can always become happier. And that's her great contribution to the field. The next grandparent is Aaron Antonovsky. Aaron Antonovsky actually is not a psychologist. He's a sociologist. He initially taught at Yale University, then moved to Israel, teaching in the southern part of Israel. And he was always concerned about focusing on what works. Specifically, here was his question. He said, how is it that there are certain people who go through life in a different way than others? He said, I know that life is hard. It's hard for me, it's hard for everyone. There is suffering, there is pain, there is disappointment. And yet, some people are able to better deal with all the pain and suffering and disappointment. How are they different from the others? In other words, he focused on what is working. He didn't just study those people who were having problems, who were struggling, who were depressed or anxious, which is what psychology did historically. He said, let's study those few who are successful, who are thriving and flourishing alongside suffering and pain and disappointment and frustration. And he changed the way we do research. He changed our approach to looking at the world, to looking at our lives. And he focused on the question, the research question, as the important starting point, as the pillar, which later became the pillar of positive psychology. I want to read to you something that he said about the importance of questions, talking about salutogenesis. Saluto means health, genesis, the beginning. And he said, if we want to understand what can make us happier or more resilient or have better relationships, we need to start by asking questions about the happiest people. We need to ask questions about the healthiest people. We need to ask questions about the best relationships and learn from this, which is very different from what traditional psychology focused on, which is, let's study divorce and see how we can avoid it. Let's study depression and see how we can help those depressed people. This is important, and, not or, and it's also important to study what is working. Reality, reality, reality. All right, so here is Antonovsky. From pathogenic questions, the origin of pathology, to salutogenic questions, the origin of health. All those familiar with the history of science are aware that important advances come with the formulation of new questions. The question is the breakthrough, the answer comes with difficulty, but it is the new question that is important. The salutogenic question, I submit to you, is a radically new question which provides the impetus for formulating a new paradigm to help us understand health and illness. It has serious implications for researcher and clinician, biological and social scientist alike. With this very brief paragraph, essentially, Aaron Antonovsky laid the foundation of positive psychology, because he said, and this is what positive psychology says, we need to begin with the different sets of questions rather than just asking, if I'm a therapist, for example, what is making you so unhappy? Why are you depressed? What's not going well in your life? The positive psychologist asks, what is going well in your life? Tell me about your happiest experience, even if overall you're not doing well. Instead of asking, what's not working in your relationship? What is the problem? Where don't you connect? Instead asking, and this is the positive psychologist, which builds on Grandpa Antonovsky, what is working in your relationship? What is going well? Tell me about your best experience together. And then building on that. Not ignoring what is not working and not ignoring what is. And now we get to the parents. With these illustrious grandparents, another chain, another part of the chain is Ellen Langer. Ellen Langer, who now spends her time in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and in Mexico. What Ellen Langer did was brought again a breath of fresh air. A breath of fresh air into the field of psychology. She was the first woman, tenured professor in Harvard's psychology department. Not only that, she was the first one to talk about joy and love and happiness, all in the context of leading a more mindful life. And Ellen Langer did research on what makes people flourish and thrive. And she did research not just on learning disabilities, she did research on learning abilities. And what is it that we need to introduce into the learning process to help us learn better? So in so many ways, she was the product of the salutogenic movement question. And in the 1970s, long before Seligman declared positive psychology as a field, she was doing work in that area, and she continues to do it today. And I had the good fortune of being her graduate student. Studied with her for 6 years. And she continues to do work and to create more rings in that chain among her students who now teach around the world. And my other teacher, another grandfather, is Philip Stone, who was right here in Akumal in 1999 alongside Martin Seligman, creating the field of positive psychology. And in 1999, that year, when he came back from Akumal, he said to me, I'm going to teach a class on positive psychology. Would you like to be my teaching assistant? And I said, of course. And for 6 years, I was his teaching assistant, working with him. And what he brought home to me most was, yes, of course, the ideas of positive psychology that I learned from him, but even more so, being a role model. And I'll tell you just a quick story about him. So this was that same year, not in Akumal, but in Lincoln, Nebraska. And the Gallup organization invited Seligman, Philip Stone, Barbara Fredrickson, Sonia Lubemirsky, Ed Diner, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, and all the great scholars that we study. They invited them for a conference. It was the world's first positive psychology conference. Not just a select group like in Akumal where they came in to think about the future, to have a Manhattan project like, but rather they invited students from all over the world to learn firsthand from the scholars whom I just mentioned. And Phil Stone asked me whether I wanted to go. And And of course, this was a dream come true, to meet all the people that I've read about. So I joined him, and we spent 4 beautiful days in Lincoln, Nebraska. And I remember 2 instances, more than I remember anything else. So yes, it was my first time hearing Professor Seligman speak and Professor Csikszentmihalyi talk about flow, and Ed Dinner talk about subjective well-being, and Barbara Fredrickson introduce for the first time the idea of broaden and build and positive emotions. So that was very exciting. But I remember 2 instances more than anything else from that. One was at a Starbucks. We went in and he got a cup of coffee. But he didn't just get the cup of coffee. He asked the person who served him, a young woman, how she was. And he started to talk to her. And in 3 minutes, 4 minutes, they had a real conversation. And he smiled at her and she smiled back. And he cared about her as a person, and she knew it. She felt it. And I was looking on the side and I said, wow, that's what I want to be when I grow up. I remember that interaction. One interaction that I'm sure had made a difference in her life. It certainly made a difference in mine. And then the following day, another instance that I remember. It was lunchtime between talks, and I was just lying in bed reading, and there's a knock on my door. And I open it, and it's Phil Stone. And he asks me, Tal, do you want to go for a walk? And I ask him, walk where? And he said, just walk. And I'll never forget that. And my children will never forget that. Because there was an important lesson here. We can just walk. And he often taught the fact that we're not human doings, we're human beings. And he wasn't against doing. He certainly did a lot in his life. And he so much emphasized being. And what an important lesson for a young student or a young child to learn. You know, talking about symbolism and mysticism is not something we do a lot of in the course because we're evidence-based. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Because there are so many things that happen to us in our lives that we cannot explain through science. But they happen, and that's real. So let me tell you about one such instance. This was, I remember the date, the 6th of September, 2005. Philip Stone invites Tammy, my wife, and me, and our baby, David, to his house, just for a grill. We had salmon. And David was a year old, and he was lying on the floor there crawling. And suddenly he got up for the first time in his life, and he started to walk. Just walk. David learned how to walk in Phil Stone's home. Coincidence? Possibly. Interesting? Definitely. Just walk, leading by example. Everything that I teach, and some of you have heard me say this before, everything that I teach comes from my intellectual parents, Alan Langer and Philip Stone. And I'm serving it forward to you today and every day that we meet. And then there is Professor Seligman, who put together those scholars who brought ideas from the past to the present to create a better future, who in 1998 was elected as the president of the American Psychological Association, just like Maslow was 30 years before. And he explicitly expressed two agendas as the president in his opening speech. The first agenda, we need to make psychology more applied. We need to take psychology out of the ivory tower and bring it to all the therapists, and bring it to schools, and bring it to companies, to organizations, and bring it to nations. Because it's not enough that psychology focuses on problems, on neurosis, and psychosis, and depression, and anxiety. It's important, but it's not enough. We need to focus on that and on the full part of the glass, and on joy and love and strength and virtue and kindness. And we need to do it. And here he learned an important historical lesson. We need to do it in a rigorous manner. It needs to be based on rigorous thought, on research, on science. And this is how our fate will be different from the fate of humanistic psychology. We're standing on the shoulders of giants. Maslow, Horney, and Tarnowski, they're giants, who, by the way, stand on the shoulders of other giants, like Aristotle, and like Marianne Evans, and like Lao Tzu. And we're going to change the trajectory of the chain just a little bit and create this positive psychology. And when I was thinking of Martin Seligman, I've had the great fortune of meeting him, so on the video as well, of spending time with him, of reading his works, teaching his works. The best way to learn is to teach. And yet, I didn't have the privilege of spending a lot of time with him, as much as I spent with Alan Langer, with Philip Stone. And I thought of speaking about him because, in many ways, we're here today continuing his work through the work we're doing in happiness studies. And I thought, who could come and talk about him in a more intimate way? Who knows him? Perhaps as I knew and know Alan Langer and Philip Stone. And of course, the person that came to mind was our very own Arlene Solotkin, who was his direct student. So Arlene. And what I thought we would do is have a conversation about him. Because, again, you had the privilege of spending a lot of time with him. Arlene is a graduate of the MAP program, the Masters in Applied Positive Psychology program. And I don't know how many actually know this, she's also now a professor of happiness studies, one of the faculty members in our master's degree. So, are you ready? Yeah. Let's do it. Over to you. Do we have another microphone, or do we? Thank you.
Well, first of all, I do want to take a minute because this is very special to me. First of all, speaking with you, to our lovely community. Second of all, in Akumal. And sometimes, reality gets better than our dreams. But I never thought that I would be invited to speak about the professor who really changed my life forever, with my professor who would be added in my presentation. If I was giving this presentation, your picture would be there as well. So thank you.
So, thank you very much. So meaningful for me to hear that. And why don't we start by you sharing where you met Seligman for the first time and how that evolved into, again, the chain to what you're doing today.
Well, as you said, things are sometimes spiritual and sometimes there is a bigger plan than we think. So I got married almost 30 years ago, and my husband wanted to do an MBA. I was still an undergraduate, and he applied to many schools. My English was horrible, but I applied to many schools. And at the end, we ended, both of us, in the University of Pennsylvania. And so this was 27 years ago when we started. And I entered this huge classroom. I was studying a major in psychology and communications. I entered this big hall of like 300 students. And there is a teacher assistant, Andrew Chappé, who is a co-author of the Resilient Factor with Karen Ravitch. And he asks this question: who is here because they needed to fulfill the credit of psychopathology? So a lot of people, they raise their hand. Who are here because they were just interested in the topic? And who are here because they want to study with Marty Seligman? And I had no idea who he was. So that was the class that I took with him then, and I was hooked forever. And then I had the chance to apply for a seminar class. We were only about 12 students taking a class in his office with him for a whole semester. He gave us the Optimistic Child book in a binder because it had not been published yet. So this was 3 years before he was or 2 years before he was the president for the APA, American Psychological Association. So that's when I met him, and yeah.
Amazing. So, tell me, what to you is, from his work, from his way of thinking, from his way of doing, is connected to us, to what we're doing?
I would say everything. I think Seligman, I would define him as a visionary, and I would define him as a strategic thinker. He is a person that I would say is not at all satisfied with the reality that we're living in. Maybe this has changed a little bit in the last years, but he has a broader vision, a vision that is maybe so high that might be even a little bit the same source of his discontentment, So he has been shifting a lot of perspectives in terms of, going from pessimism to optimism or helplessness to agency, which is one of the topics that he studies today. He's, of course, bridging science with the practical applications of all the teachings. He's been working with many different fields, just like you said. He has done work that for the Army of the United States to build resilience and well-being. He has been also behind the work of Karen Ravitch, who has done a lot of resilience training also for communities that experience poverty and difficult situations in Philadelphia and beyond. And And of course, he has worked with, he has inspired positive education, positive governance. So I think there are many, many bridges.
Yeah. You know, as you're talking, I'm thinking about the work that we're doing here. And I know that so many of you are interested in education, or child development. Many are interested in business. You're interested in applying it to the world of medicine. And this interdisciplinary approach is so central to what we do. And also the fact that he started by studying pessimism. You know, he started studying learned helplessness. And then he moved over to study optimism. Or the fact that he's, studied impact of our past experiences. He's a psychotherapist. Now he's studying our future. So in many ways, his approach is a holistic approach. And he didn't call it, as we call it, whole being. But in so many ways, he laid the foundation to the study, to the genius of the and. Let's study learned helplessness and pessimism, and let's also study optimism. It's not the tyranny of the or, it's the genius of the and that we often talk about.
So I think something that I find interesting also is how, when you talk about happiness, you and then we talk a lot about not being happy all the time, giving ourselves permission to be human. And I think something that I also find common is how sometimes suffering and search for oneself, for what moves us, is a common element between you and him, for example, and I can relate to that.
Yeah, and this is also where we can see a difference between what we're doing, what Professor Seligman is doing, and the self-help movement. Because you will find books, self-help books, that will tell you, if you do these 5 things, you'll be happy all the time. Or if you introduce this into your life, you will always be calm. You'll no longer experience anxiety. And that doesn't exist. That's unrealistic. So creating a field or an intervention, whether it's in school, whether it's in a business, whether it's in a hospital, we need to take into consideration reality. And part of reality is that we do experience sadness and frustration and unhappiness. And if you ignore that, you pay a very high price, which is why so many of the self-help books, so many of the new age interventions actually in the long term lead to more harm than good. Not all of them, some are great and some are way ahead of science. But so many of them introduce interventions that are harmful, introduce ideas that are harmful. And what we need to do, and again, this is standing on the shoulders of Seligman and Langer and all those that we spoke about, is go slowly, step by step. Make sure we have the science before we talk about something. In other words, under-promise and over-deliver, rather than over-promise and under-deliver. And I think that is where Seligman has been very careful when he created positive psychology.
Yeah, his approach to science, of course, is incredible. He has written around 300 or something papers and many, many books, but he really relies on that, the importance of knowing, what to do. And something that, that you remind me of is how many times he has expressed his own doubts. That is something that I admire a lot about him, that he has, when I was studying math, he would come sometimes feeling down, feeling Is this worth it? Is what we're doing enough? And how can we prove and how can we double check and make sure that everything that we are talking about really makes a difference in our world?
Yeah. You know, as you're talking, I'm thinking about bringing the idea of the and to our personal lives, because you know, you talked about the discontent that you often experienced, and I think of how important it is to experience discontent, because there are so many things that need to improve, certainly in the world, in ourselves, and at the same time to also appreciate the things that are going well. And I think the healthy approach, again, we were talking about the world, but the healthy approach on an individual level is to say to ourselves, yeah, there are things that I need to work on. And as Karen Horney reminds us, it's a lifelong process. And what can I appreciate in terms of what I've already done, in terms of my journey? And I think this, what Peter Senge, another great scholar, calls creative tension. This creative tension between discontent and appreciation, I think that is a healthy approach to change.
I think that's a very healthy approach to change, and I think that is one of the main missions that we have, both in positive psychology and in the happiness movement, because when we see the world, you know, and we see the younger generations, and I think this is one of your concerns and Seligman's concerns as well, but when we see the younger generations and the level of depression, anxiety, you know, the rates of suicide, one of the things Seligman also talks about is we need to really enhance and share everything that's gotten better in the world in the last decades. Or, you know, if we compare what's been happening today in the levels of, you know, poverty, analphabetism, health-wise, you know, we have access to so many things, and we, as human beings, are more and more powerful today than ever before. Our voices can be heard. By typing something and clicking it, that people around the world will hear it. And we need to really be able to embrace that power, to inspire ourselves and remind us ourselves that what we do matters. And then to go and share this with the world, because we really need to bring that, you know, positive spire and work around it. And when we have doubts, and when Seligman has doubts, approach like-minded people and say, is what I'm doing important, you know? Am I going on the right direction? And what is incredible is that, you know, humility, even in those great and giant minds, for them to say, can you mirror something beautiful that I have co-created, you know? I think that's...
Yeah, I love that, and I have to say something about this, and many of you have heard me tell this story, but it really is, I think, a very important story that comes from, that I heard as a child, and it's a story that comes from the Jewish tradition. And what it's about us always having two pieces of paper, one piece of paper in one pocket and a second piece of paper in another pocket. And the two pieces of paper are quotes from the Bible or the Talmud. And the first quote says, I came from dust and I will return to dust. I came from the soil and I will return to the soil. That's quote number one pocket. Quote number two in the second pocket is taken from the Talmud, which is one of the traditional Jewish texts. The quote says, for me, the world was created. For me, the world was created. So one says, who am I? You know, I'm food for the worms. The other pocket says, all this miracle created for me. And the reason why I end we need to have these two pockets, because when we feel down and disappointed and weak, we should look in this pocket and say, for me, the world was created, and that will strengthen us. But when we feel arrogant and too sure of ourselves, hey, don't forget where you came from and where you're going, Buster. So we need to have this balance. And again, the creative tension between these two extremes is a healthy tension. Just like it's a healthy tension between appreciating of the past and being discontent about the present or future. What else, Arlene? What else have you learned from Seligman?
I mean, I have so many memories and so many beautiful things to remember, but I think one aspect that caught my attention was when he was explaining his own creative process, because, you know, there are many ways to create, you know, for creation, you know, we invent things, we deduce things, we infer things, but he talked about a way for him of seeing the world where you really don't see, he called it a ground reversal, figure reversal, which is, have you seen, for example, these pictures where you see in white, you can see, if you look at the white part of the drawing, you see a dog, and if you look at the dark part of the picture, you see a rabbit or something like that. So that's called ground figure reversal. And he said, that's my creative process, he says. He's looking at the world in a way where he sees something that is already there, but that most people don't see. And I think this is really interesting because he has really been working, you could call it against our conceived or rational notions of the world, but really trying to ignite a part of the world that is already there, but we are not focusing at. So, for example, again, for him saying, some of his recent work has to do with prospection. You know, we come from, you know, this historic and psychological and philosophical view about focusing on the past. And he's saying it's not the same to be pushed by the past than pulled by the future. So we, for example, try to solve depression talking about our problems and going back to the roots and trying to find, you know, where did you lose yourself? But he says that's not the, you know, we are not going to find what matters to us if we go back to the past to see where we lost it. It's much better to think about the future and see what do you want to do with your life? What do you see for yourself, for the world? And have that vision pull you into it. And it makes it much easier as well. So that's something beautiful that I saw, interesting because it's in this piece of work, but I think it's present also in many other moments of his life.
You know, that's so interesting, because if you think to what Aaron Antonovsky did, what he did, remember, shift from the pathogenic to the salutogenic. So the history of medicine, the history of psychology, remember he was a sociologist, the history of sociology looked at problems. So in sociology, you know, maybe one of the greatest sociologists, Durkheim, talked about suicide. Sociology talks about, you know, the poor, the people who are left behind. And, you know, why does that happen? In medicine, the focus is on pathology. At least in the West, the focus is on pathology. In psychology, neurosis, psychosis, depression, anxiety. And what Antonovsky comes and says, wait a minute, that's only part of reality. That's just maybe the white in that picture. Let's look at the black part of the picture, because you'll see something very different. Again, don't ignore the white, don't ignore the poverty, don't ignore suicides, but But let's also look at who is flourishing and who's thriving. What can we learn from them? Let's look at amazing relationships. Maybe they're not the majority, but they're there. Let's learn from that. And that's where you have reality, because part of reality is the white element in the picture, and part of reality is the black element in the picture. Or the colors of the rainbow, if it's a more complex picture. And it's all there. And what questions do we ask can make all the difference. Also on a personal level, because if I ask, as Seligman says, what's holding me back? Why am I so anxious all the time? It's very different from asking, what excites me? And remember, anxiety and excitement, for those of you who have already gotten there in the course, they're emotional cousins. They're very close. So just focusing on the past versus focusing on the future can make all the difference to my experience. Or in a relationship. Why are we fighting so often? Versus, where do we feel connected and alive? Not ignoring the conflict. Not ignoring the anxiety, and not ignoring the other part of the picture. The excitement and the love. And that's how we lead a full and fulfilling life, and that's how we're more likely to flourish. One last thing, Arlene, what would you like to reflect on?
One last thing. I came across a very interesting study that was done by a political scientist from Harvard. And she studied, what happens with peaceful movements, with peaceful revolutions, let's say. And she studied a lot of different movements that happened around the world in the last 100 years. And she looked at some movements that have been ignited by, aggression and have been, aggressive movements. And she studied peaceful campaigns as well. And what she discovered after studying like 300 movements, and she was very careful with these movements, to the point where, the Indian revolution was not even considered one of those peaceful movements, because there was a lot of, aggression in the movement as well. So she was very careful in what to choose. And what she found is that peaceful movements are twice as likely, 2 times more likely to bring about positive change than aggressive campaigns or aggressive revolutions. And this is really, it's incredible work. I just want to share with you the name of the article, because I think the name is really, how a small minority can change the world.
How what?
A small minority
How a small minority can change the world.
And what she found is that 3.5% of the population in these specific countries, for example, that she studied, needed to be involved in the peaceful movements in order for them to be effective. So if we think about positive psychology, if we think about the happiness revolution, what can we do to ignite and to become the 3.5% of the population worldwide, to really shift our consciousness and bring about a happy world, a flourishing world? And so she says it's doable. It's been done before. Marty Seligman has the idea that for the year 2051, 51% of the population worldwide should be flourishing. And then the pandemic hit, and then a lot of things has changed. But if we become conscious of the power that each of us has in making this a reality, and we get together and we commit, I think we can make this happen.
Arlene, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. Thank you for your inspiring words. And I can't wait to continue our journey together. Thank you. Thank you, Arlene. Wow. And this is why we do what we do. So we have a few minutes before we break for lunch. And I would love to hear from you. If you have any questions about what we discussed today, or as you know, any other question, because everything is interconnected. Please.
Tal, I was impressed for your lecture when you mentioned that you were not, able to write, and your teacher helped you to find your own voice, right? That you started writing books and you have not stopped writing. So I have someone in my team that is very low performer. How can I help this person to find his voice? I understand, this balance that you mentioned, that being aware of the negative, but also taking consideration the positive. How can I make this connection? It is not clear to me. Now I know that I need to take in consideration both, but how I can use this both, the whole vision, in order to help someone to find their own voice.
Thank you for the question. And the question is, how can we help other people find their voice? And the story you were referring to is that I had the good fortune of having a teacher. Her name is Maxine Rodberg, who encouraged me when I was taking basic writing course. She encouraged me to express my own voice. And there are two important elements that go into encouraging people to find their voice. The first one is very simple. Encourage them to find their own voice. Tell them, I want to hear you speak. I don't want to hear your teacher. I don't want to hear me. I want to hear you. That's the first thing. But the second thing, which is less trivial, has to do, in general, with what great leadership is about. You see, there's been a lot of research over the past 50 years around extraordinary leadership. And extraordinary leadership is exactly what we need in extraordinary times, such as the time we're going through right now. Or in a time when the person we're working with is going through an extraordinary time. Difficult times, challenging times, for example. And what the research shows, that extraordinary leaders, again, those people who help others find their voice, even in the midst of hardship, who help others flourish, even when there are challenges. These extraordinary leaders have particular characteristics that are the most important. And you know what these characteristics are? It's not how charismatic they are. Yeah, charisma is nice to have, not a must for extraordinary leadership. Far from it. It's not how brilliant they are. Yeah, if a leader is brilliant, that's nice. Absolutely not essential. It's not how eloquent they are, how well they speak. Nice, not necessary. There is one characteristic that came up time and time again when we studied extraordinary leaders. And when I talk about leaders, I don't just mean the Fortune 500 CEO. I also mean that teacher who's helping her students find their voice. I'm also talking about the parent who's raising children. I'm also talking about that best friend who's helping her friend through difficult times. And I'm also talking about that political leader and community leader and mentor. I'm talking about all those. The one characteristic that came up again and again and again is listening. Our ability to listen. Children who are listened to grow up to be confident adults. Children who are listened to are more likely to express their voice than children who were not listened to. Employees in an organization who are listened to are more likely to stay in the workplace. You know, how much talk is there today about the great resignation? Well, you want to keep your employees in the workplace? First and foremost, listen to them. There's a lot of research on relationships showing how important it is for couples to listen to one another, to hear the other's voice. In many ways, what listening does is it creates the soil, the conditions for flourishing. And part of flourishing is finding our voice. So yes, encourage in words. Be yourself. Be true to yourself. Be authentic. I want to hear you. And, even more importantly, listen. You know, when I talk about intellectual well-being, and many of you have already gone through that module in the course, I talk about the importance of stories. And the most influential book throughout history, certainly in the Western world, is the Bible. And again, whether you personally are religious or not, whether you see it as the Word of God or written by very smart people, that's beside the point. The point, though, is that there are many stories there that communicate very important messages. And remember, one of the differences between happiness studies and positive psychology is that happiness studies brings together different disciplines. Yes, of course, it brings psychology and positive psychology and neuroscience and theology and economics and literature and film. So I want to share with you a very telling story that goes to your question from the Bible. When God chooses Moses to lead his people from slavery to freedom, do you know what Moses' first response is to God? His first response is, I can't do it. Thanks, but no thanks. Why? Because I have a speech impediment. Because I stutter. That's the first thing that Moses says to God. I can't be the leader that you're looking for, that extraordinary leader in extraordinary times that you're looking for. And yet God chooses Moses to lead his people. And what's the message there? It's not as important what you say or how well you say it. What's more important, you have the ears. You can listen. And therefore you're going to lead. So this is a story, and then we have the research today to show us just how important that is for helping others' voice emerge. Thank you for the question. Yes.
I wanted to ask if you...
If you can introduce yourself before, just...
yes. Yeah. My name is Fatima, and I'm not in the course. I'm just here with my mother. But I wanted to ask, if you were to talk to teenagers or people like around 20 and 25 who are feeling empty or insecure or self-doubting, what would you say, like in easy words? Something. I don't know, if I wanted to come back and help my friends, what would I say to them?
If they're self-doubting and
How, like if they wanted to learn how to stay in this happiness and this
Yeah.
positive psychology.
right. So what would I say? What would we say to people who, in order to encourage them to come into the science of happiness? And you know, this is something that I'm sure many of you have heard me say in webinars. You know, let's begin with the business. If I go to a company and I say to the manager of that company, I can come in and give a lecture or create an intervention in your organization, and it will make your employees happier. What that manager, what she will say to me is likely, that's wonderful, Tal. Why don't you come and speak at our Christmas party to our employees? Because I want them to be happier. But if I come to that same manager and I say to her, I can come in and increase levels of happiness in your organization by 3%, 4%. And as a result of it, they'll become more creative. Innovation levels will go up. And they will become more productive and engaged. And you know what? Retention rates, remember the Great Resignation, are going to go up as a result of this intervention. Then she's more likely to say, okay, that's interesting. Why don't you come in? And it's the same on an individual level. You need to talk to the young generation, or the older generation for that matter, about science, about evidence. This is how it's going to potentially change your life. And again, remember, under-promise, over-deliver. It's not going to help you be exempt from painful emotions. It's not going to eradicate, get rid of sadness in your life, or frustration, or anger, or unhappiness. These things are going to stay there. They're a part of life. However, there's research, there's science that shows that there are certain things that you can introduce into your life and actually become happier, calmer, less sad, or depressed, or anxious. And then it becomes more interesting. In other words, you have to lead with evidence. Now, does this mean that science is always right? Of course not. You know, there were theories and ideas and research done by some of the greatest minds of our time that ended up being wrong. But then you learn from it. And the next iteration is closer to the truth. And that's how science evolves. And that's how we learn and how we grow. So I would lead, in terms of convincing people, I would lead with scientific evidence. And this is, again, what distinguishes, this is what I talked about at the beginning. This is what distinguishes what we do from self-help or New Age. And again, not to dismiss self-help and New Age. There are many interesting ideas that are worth looking at and exploring and engaging in me search around them. And then, hopefully, either you or others will also subject them to research and see whether it's something that we want to teach and want to introduce, whether it's in our companies or to our friend or in our schools and hospitals. Thank you.
I think just one last question.
Wow.
Tal, we're running out of
Okay, we'll have
questions.
much more time tomorrow for questions,
Yeah.
but
So who do you want to pick? I will hand over this.
that's above my pay grade.
I will choose a gentleman in the front because we have to.
So you're for diversity and inclusion, so we'll give men a chance as well.
My name is Mark Rosenblum. I'm a physician, and I have been calling myself an anti-aging and longevity physician. I'm going to start calling myself a salutogenic physician.
Huh.
And there is a whole group of physicians in anti-aging, or salutogenesis, even though we don't call that. What we deal with a lot is the 99% of physicians that just deal with disease and just give drugs and don't promote health. And this group, my group and what I do is really a lot of what you're talking about. So how can we make a real difference with the rest of medicine, let's say, in order to fix this?
Thank you for that. That's great. So just to repeat, if you haven't heard, what's your name again?
Mark Rosenblum.
Mark. So Mark is a physician, a medical doctor, who said that you called yourself an anti-aging doctor, and now you're going to change that to salutogenic doctor. Or I have another term that feel free to use. Instead of anti-aging, how about pro-aging? I wrote there's research that I wrote about years ago by Rebecca Levy. Rebecca Levy, she's a professor at Yale University. And what she shows is that people who have a positive approach to aging, who see the upside of aging, who instead of just asking, what are the problems that come with age, what are the good things that come with age, and focus on that. Again, not ignore whether it's the health issues or things that we lose with age, but at the same time not ignore the good things, such as more wisdom, experience, more acceptance, perhaps, more happiness, potentially. So people who have a pro-aging approach are not just happier, they actually live longer. So I urge you to look at the work of Rebecca Levy on pro-aging. Now, what do we do as physicians? In many ways, when you look at the field of medicine, you have two very different models. You have the Western model and you have the Eastern model. Western model is about fixing. You have a broken hand, we'll fix it. You have some germs in your body, we'll get rid of them. And Western medicine has been incredibly successful, and we certainly don't want to get rid of it. At the same time, we also have Eastern medicine, which is, don't just look at the hand, or don't just look at, perhaps your heart where you're feeling some pain. Look at the whole system. Look at how you can improve the energy that flows through your system. Now, there are many people in the Western tradition who just dismiss Eastern medicine as alternative medicine. Well, this is, for those who cannot really be tough and do the real medicine. And vice versa, people who dismiss Western medicine for only looking at a part of the whole and not the whole. Now, both have part of the truth. Once again, it's not the or, it's the and. It's the and. Let's look at, the heart, if there are problems with the heart, and let's look at fix the hand, and let's look at the whole system. And that is related to another and, which is fixing and preventing. When someone comes to me and says, I'm experiencing depression, or what sounds to me like clinical anxiety, I will not tell them, okay, now do write 5 gratitudes a day and start running and keep a journal and you'll be fine. Come back to me in 2 weeks. No. Under promise, over deliver. I will tell him, go see a therapist. Talk to a professional. Maybe a psychiatrist. Fix. And at the same time, let's engage with prevention. Whether you who came to me with clinical anxiety or for our children and all of us. So to look at those two approaches, whether it's to psychology or medicine, fix when we need to fix and preventative medicine. And again, to look at science. Because science can tell us a lot. You know, one of the psychologists whose name I bring up in the course is David Servan Schreiber. David Servan Schreiber. David Servan Schreiber he passed away a few years ago, was a world-leading psychiatrist and trained in Western tradition, you know, was a medical doctor, then became a psychiatrist. And he helped people with medication. Zoloft, Prozac, you name it, he gave it. And he said many times it helped, but many times it didn't. And then he would often meet those people who came to him for treatment. He met them a year later or 2 years later, and they were doing well, they were doing fine. And he asked them, so what happened? And some of them said, I don't know, I'm just feeling better, because we have a natural healer within us. But some of them said to him, you know, I had some acupuncture. I went to my Chinese doctor. Or I meditated. Or I started an exercise regime. And he started, and he said, as a scientist, I have to look at these things. And he started to study what he considered until that day alternative medicine. You know, the mystical part. Oh, it's all the placebo. He actually started to study. And he found that a lot of it is placebo. And a lot of it goes way beyond the placebo. And he wrote a book by the name of The Instinct to Heal. The Instinct to Heal. He wrote a book where he identified a few interventions that are considered alternative medicine, which he says work and work well, meaning work much better than placebo. For example, some elements in acupuncture stood the test of science. For example, regular physical exercise, and we talk about it, as powerful as our most powerful psychiatric medication. And omega-3 actually contributes to mental and physical health, to child development and to slowing down of aging. And he is a good role model for us. One of the people I would certainly have up here in terms of his picture is a role model. He's a good role model for us to show how we need to embrace the and apply the scientific lens to it. And when we apply the scientific lens, it's not just, you know, go and publish a paper in an academic journal, which is, you know, Seligman did it, 300 times. It's not just that. It's looking at academic journals, reading them, studying, which is what we're doing day in and day out, through the certificate in happiness studies, through the master's in happiness studies. We're looking at important research. And no less important, to take the scientific approach to our lives and engage in research, experiment, try things out. And that's how we grow, and that's how we learn. And that's how, by extension, when we help ourselves, we also help others through our stories, through our experiences. I cannot express to you, really, I cannot express to you how much appreciation I feel right now to be spending our time together in Akumal, building on that chain, and together creating a better world, and together contributing to the happiness revolution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tal. Thank you so much. So this is it for this morning. We're going right now. Oh, sorry. We're going for lunch. So the same restaurant we had breakfast at, in the same place, we have a special place for us. And we're coming back here at 2. I want to make a clarification. The business activity we had planned, we decided to have a workshop about going from passion to purpose. So it is not business, specifically business focused,